The night had a strange way of breathing. Not loudly, not with the obvious rhythm of wind moving through half-open windows or branches scraping against forgotten walls, but with the slow and deliberate inhale of something alive, something patient, something that understood the quiet corners of a room better than the man standing inside it. The air itself felt thick, as if every particle carried a weight that pressed softly against his skin, urging him to notice what most people spend their entire lives trying to ignore. It began with the sound of the wind sighing along the edge of the house, a low murmur that seemed too steady, too intentional, the kind of sound that made the night feel crowded. In the far distance, a lonely clock ticked with a rhythm that felt almost mocking steady, calm, indifferent, while the man stood in front of the mirror, trying to understand why the surface of the glass felt colder than the room behind it. His own reflection stared back, but it wasn't the reflection that unsettled him. It was the unmistakable sensation that behind the reflection, behind the thin sheet of silver and light, a pair of eyes that did not belong to him were watching with a quiet hunger. He leaned closer, breath slow, shoulders tense. For a moment the room seemed to darken without losing light, and the mirror pulsed with a strange heaviness, like it was no longer a surface but a doorway, thin, fragile, pulsating, waiting for the right moment to open. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the ancient instinct to become alert in the presence of something unseen, yet undeniably real. The floor beneath him gave a soft sound, a creak far too gentle to be caused by his own weight. It was as if someone or something had taken a single step inside the same room, but on a plane he could not see. He turned, breath steady, stoic training rising in his chest like a silent shield. Nothing there. Nothing visible. Nothing he could point to. And yet the air told a different story. The air whispered that he was no longer alone. People often dismiss these moments, these subtle intrusions of presence, as tricks of the mind, but he knew better. A Stoic understands that before the world touches the body, it first touches the mind. And what touched his mind now was not imagination, it was intrusion. An energy testing the boundaries of his space, searching for a weakness, probing the edges of his awareness like a hand sliding under a locked door. He inhaled slowly, letting the breath move through him like a river smoothing stone. Fear is a reaction. Observation is a choice. He chose observation. And in that quiet, he felt it clearly, a presence standing just beyond the corner of his vision. Not fully formed, not manifesting in shadow or shape, but alive in intention. Watching him, measuring him, waiting. Some nights hold their darkness the way a hand holds a blade tight, silent, ready. This was one of those nights. And with a kind of clarity only discomfort can offer, he realized something few dare to acknowledge. There are shadows that do not belong to rooms, but to people. Some energies knock, others break in. The world teaches us to fear what we can see. But the true Stoic one who has walked through inner storms knows the real threat moves without form, without footsteps, without the courtesy of being seen. It is not claws or teeth or monsters under the bed. It is intention. It is envy sharpened into a weapon. It is silent malice drifting like smoke. And it is the unseen presence that now breathed beside him, bending the stillness of the air in a way no physical intruder could. He closed his eyes not to hide, but to sense more clearly. Because there is a moment, a rare one, that comes before every spiritual attack, where the mind feels the ripple before the storm strikes, where the soul recognizes that it is being studied by something that does not wish it well. And tonight, that moment arrived. If you've ever felt this pressing, watching, breathing darkness, you already know you're not imagining it. You're perceiving it. And perception is the first form of defense, the earliest awakening of your inner citadel. Before we go deeper into the signs, before we pull back the curtain on the presence that lingers where no footsteps fall, take a moment to anchor yourself. If you're new here, subscribe to True Stoic Way, where we don't look away from the shadows, and we don't fear what others pretend isn't real. We illuminate the unseen, we sharpen the mind, and we reclaim the power that darkness tries to swallow. Now, let's step beyond the threshold. Let's talk about the first sign, the hunger that drains your energy long before you ever realize you're under attack. Sign 1, energy draining, the hunger that doesn't sleep. Adrian had always been the kind of man whose energy filled a room before his footsteps did. The kind of presence that felt grounded, steady, quietly powerful in a way that made people trust him, even when he said nothing at all. Yet in the months leading up to the night his life shifted, that grounded strength began dissolving in a way so subtle he did not notice the unraveling until it was too late. Until the hunger that stalked him had sunk its unseen teeth far deeper than any physical wound could reach. It began with the kind of fatigue most people would blame on stress, the kind that creeps into the body like a fog dragging cold fingers across skin. Yet Adrian's fatigue was different, heavier, as if something had pressed its palm against the center of his chest and began to siphon whatever fire he carried inside. His mornings no longer felt like beginnings. They felt like aftermaths, like he had been fighting invisible battles through the night while his body lay motionless on the bed. Sleep became a battlefield where he woke up more exhausted than when he surrendered to it, breath thick in his lungs as though he had been running through darkness for hours. He tried to ignore it at first, convincing himself that life ebbed and flowed and that he simply needed rest, but rest betrayed him. The deeper he sank into his mattress at night, the more vivid the sensation became that someone or something was drawing near, not to harm his body, but to drink from the quiet well of his energy in a way that felt intimate and hostile all at once. It was not a nightmare. Nightmares frighten and shock. This was different. This was familiar. This was patient. Some nights he would half wake to the sensation of a weight settling onto the side of the bed, the dip so subtle he thought he imagined it. Yet the air around him would still shift, becoming warm in one moment and chilling in the next, like breath brushing against the back of his neck. His limbs felt heavier during these moments, as if pinned under the slow, deliberate touch of something that desired not pain, but extraction, an unhurried harvest of energy he didn't know he was losing until he tried to stand in the morning and felt the world tilt beneath him. During the day, people noticed his pallor before he did. His eyes lost their usual spark, his posture weakened, his voice softened into something distant, like he was speaking through layers of fog. He found himself drifting through conversations without truly being present, the weight behind his thoughts thickening until it felt like he was walking underwater. When he finally admitted to himself that something was wrong, the truth didn't arrive through logic but through instinct, a deep primal knowing that the exhaustion wasn't coming from him, it was being taken from him. Whenever he returned home, the fatigue clung to him like a second skin. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with a darkness that did not belong to the paint or the shadows but to a presence hidden in the air, a presence that waited for him to be alone. And when he traveled for work, when he slept in hotels or stayed with friends, his energy returned with unsettling speed. His breaths deepened, his mind cleared, the fog lifted. He felt like himself again until he came back to the house and the unseen hunger opened its jaws. He never saw it, not truly, but he felt it with an intimacy that vision could never offer. The first time the sensation became undeniable, he stood in the dim light of his hallway, hands trembling slightly at his sides, when something slipped across the back of his shoulder, not cold, not warm, but undeniably present, like a hand without flesh resting on him, with the casual ownership of something that believed it had the right to touch him. His breath caught, not in panic, but in the still measured awareness of a man who understands that fear clouds perception. So he did what only a Stoic would do. He stayed still inside his mind, even as the world around him shifted. He closed his eyes and felt it there, lingering behind him, its presence forming like a shape pressed against the fabric of his energy rather than against his skin. He could sense a tether, a thin, dark strand stretching from the center of his back into the deeper shadows of the house, pulsing faintly, tightening when he breathed too deeply, loosening when he exhaled, as though it were learning the rhythm of his life. He didn't need to turn around to see it. Some things are not meant to be viewed with eyes. They are meant to be acknowledged with instinct, endured with discipline, and resisted through the kind of inner stillness that only a trained mind can wield. And this was where the truth settled inside him like a stone dropped into deep water. He was not fatigued. He was being fed upon. The hunger that drained him did not sleep, did not rest, did not break its rhythm. It only waited for him to lower his guard, for the moment he stopped observing, for the instant he forgot to anchor his mind. And the nights he forgot were the mornings he woke hollow. Before we move deeper, before we uncover what this hunger truly is, remember this: the body tires from effort, but the spirit only tires when something has reached into it without permission. And the moment you feel that intrusion, the moment your energy flickers without reason, you are no longer imagining it. You have already been seen by what feeds in silence. Now, let us step into the second sign. Sign 2. Thought corruption. When your mind starts speaking in a stranger's voice. Ilara had never been the type of woman whose thoughts wavered or tangled easily. She possessed the kind of inner calm that others envied without understanding, a quiet depth that made people confide in her, trust her, seek her presence when their own storms grew too loud, and for most of her life, that calm had been her shield, her anchor, her unshakable center, until the night her mind began whispering things she had never thought, in tones she had never owned, with an intimacy that felt like being touched from the inside by hands she could not see. It didn't begin with voices, nothing so dramatic or easy to discredit. It began with a subtle shift, like a soft rustling behind the walls of her thoughts, a faint emotional breeze that did not belong to her, brushing against the edges of her awareness with a curiosity that felt almost human. She noticed it during the late hours when the world outside her window fell silent, when her breathing became the only sound in the room, and her mind, usually a quiet sanctuary, became a hallway where the footsteps of unfamiliar emotions began to echo. One night, as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the outlines of her furniture in the dim glow of a street lamp, a thought slid into her mind with the smoothness of something practiced, something that had been waiting. You are alone because you deserve to be. It didn't shock her, not immediately. What frightened her more was how natural it sounded, how convincingly it curled inside her chest as if it had been living there for years. Except it hadn't. She knew her own emotional voice knew its textures, its colors, its shadows, and this was not it. This was colder, older, quieter, and carried a sting that felt more like accusation than reflection. In the days that followed, more thoughts drifted in, not fully formed sentences but emotional impressions, sudden bitterness at innocent memories, unearned guilt settling over her shoulders like dust, and an unease that rose fast and retreated slowly, as if someone was behind the curtain of her mind, adjusting her emotions like knobs on an old radio, turning up the fear, dimming the joy, twisting the grief ever so slightly until it became unfamiliar. Alara found herself pausing mid-breath, afraid of the next feeling that might drift in uninvited, scared of the way her chest tightened not from anxiety, but from the uncanny recognition that her own interior world no longer felt entirely hers. The confusion grew heavier at night. Thoughts that were not hers arrived like unwanted guests knocking at the edges of her consciousness, but instead of entering through the door, they seeped through the cracks thin, cold tendrils of emotion that crawled into her mind during the darkest hours. She would lie awake listening to her own breathing, each inhale feeling borrowed, each exhale trembling as if her lungs knew something she didn't. Shadows on the walls seemed to ripple with a life of their own, shifting with a rhythm too deliberate to be random, and her house, once warm and familiar, began carrying a strange scent after midnight, something faintly metallic, like old coins or forgotten blood. She tried distracting herself, reading, meditating, filling the quiet with noise, but the thoughts returned with the patience of a predator that knows it has all the time in the world. In her dreams, she saw fragments of faces she had never met, smiles that curled too slowly, eyes that watched her with a hunger that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with intrusion. And every time she tried to look away, a whisper followed her into waking. "You know me." And in the strangest, most unsettling way, she almost believed it. The corruption wasn't loud, it was intimate, like a childhood memory that had been rewritten, like someone had stood behind her for years, studying her thoughts, mimicking her emotional cadence until they could slip into her mind unnoticed. She would catch herself reacting to things with emotions that didn't fit, thinking in patterns that felt foreign, and each time she questioned it, the foreign presence seemed to lean in closer, as though amused by her confusion. Late one night, while standing in her kitchen, she felt a shift in the air that made her skin tighten, a gentle brush of wind that shouldn't exist indoors. And then, like a shadow crawling beneath a locked door, she sensed an energy enter the room. It carried with it a cold familiarity, the same one that haunted her thoughts. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. Instead, she remembered the quiet Stoic practice she had relied on for years, observing without reacting, acknowledging without surrendering. She became still inside herself, letting her mind settle like dust in an abandoned house, refusing to let the intruder sway her. But the presence lingered behind her, radiating a smile she could not see but felt in every inch of her spine. It wasn't physical, but the intention behind it was sharp curiosity laced with malice, affection twisted into intrusion, a silent declaration that it knew her thoughts better than she did. And when the next wave of foreign emotion slithered into her mind, she understood something that chilled her more than any whisper could. These thoughts did not originate from her, yet they moved through her as if they had always belonged. They were not hers, but they were learning to sound like they were. And that is how corruption begins, not with a voice, but with a familiarity so precise you begin to forget where you end and the intruder begins. Now that you've seen what happens when the mind becomes a doorway, let's move deeper into the strange objects and arrangements that mark the physical world when something unseen decides to anchor itself into your life. Sign 3. Emotional echoes. The fears that do not belong to you. There is a particular kind of disturbance that does not enter through the mind, nor through the body, but through the emotional field that surrounds a person, the invisible layer between thought and instinct, the quiet place where feelings are born before we ever name them. And when that field is breached, emotions arrive in waves that do not match the rhythm of your life. Like tides pulled by a distant moon you do not remember inviting into your sky, crashing into you with the force of something ancient and intimate, yet undeniably foreign. Mara, who had always been the sun in her circle of friends, the type of person whose laughter filled rooms and softened edges, began experiencing these shifts on days that seemed ordinary on the surface. She would be in the middle of making coffee, humming to herself, thinking about nothing of consequence, when without warning a sharp tremor of fear would pierce her chest. A fear that did not originate from any memory, any sound, any danger, as if her heart had remembered a nightmare her mind had never seen. The fear would swell, cold and pulsing, until her breath hitched and she had to grip the counter just to steady herself. On other days, she would be washing dishes, her hands submerged in warm water, mind drifting lazily, when suddenly a heavy sadness would drape itself across her shoulders like a wet cloak. The sadness was thick, almost metallic, tasting of loss she had not lived, echoing grief that did not belong to her story. It pressed against her ribs, slow and suffocating, as though mourning a memory she had never touched. She would freeze in place, unable to move, eyes stinging with tears that rose from nowhere. But the worst were the moments of sudden blistering agitation, those sharp, explosive jolts of emotion that made her feel as though someone had leaned close to her spirit and screamed without using a voice. She could be seated quietly on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, a candle burning peacefully on the table, when a burst of anger would flood her chest with the heat of something primal and destructive. Her hands would clench. Her jaw would tighten. Her pulse would spike with an intensity that frightened her. And just as quickly as it arrived, it would vanish, leaving her trembling and confused, like someone had slipped a storm into her heart and taken it back just as it began to form. These emotional waves felt less like feelings and more like echoes, vibrations from a source outside of her, carried into her world like a message delivered in a language she was never meant to understand. She began noticing a pattern, not in her actions, but in her surroundings. When she visited friends, when she worked late at the studio, when she walked through crowded stores, she felt grounded, alive, maybe even a little tired, but entirely herself. But every time she returned home, every time she stepped through her doorway, a faint tremor of cold ran up her spine, and her breath grew shallow as though the house itself exhaled sorrow into her lungs. She tried brushing it off, telling herself it was stress, hormones, a passing mood, yet the emotional distortions grew more pointed, more deliberate. There were moments she would sit on the edge of her bed and feel a ripple of dread crawl beneath her skin for no reason at all, as though another person's panic was seeping through the walls and settling into her bloodstream. There were nights she woke up with her heart pounding as if she had been crying in her sleep, even though her dreams were blank and silent. And each time she tried to anchor herself, to breathe deeply and recenter as she had learned in calmer years, another foreign emotion would slide through her chest like a whisper carried by wind through broken windows. What disturbed her most was how familiar some of the emotions felt, familiar not in origin, but in tone, as if someone she had unknowingly allowed into her life was projecting their darkness through her walls, sending fragments of their inner storms into her spirit. She sensed anger that wasn't hers, fear shaped by someone else's memories, sorrow born from wounds she had never lived. She moved through her own home like a guest walking inside someone else's grief. There was one evening, long after sunset, when the emotional intrusion became impossible to deny. She had returned from dinner with friends, still glowing from laughter, the warmth of human presence lingering in her chest. But the moment she crossed her threshold, A violent tremor of dread surged up her spine so suddenly that she staggered backward, gripping the doorknob to keep from collapsing. It wasn't her fear. She could feel that. It had no trigger, no origin in her own life. It was an echo, pure, raw, and so overpowering it felt like a scream pressed against her bones. She inhaled slowly, the way she had once been taught by a mentor who lived like a monk trapped in a modern world. Breath steady, mind observed but untouched, emotion witnessed but uncaptured. She steadied herself not by fighting the dread, but by refusing to claim it. And in that stillness, she sensed a truth she had not dared to face until now. Her house was holding emotions that did not belong to her. Sorrow with no place of birth. Fear with no face or cause. Anger with no spark to ignite it. These were not feelings, they were visitors. And some visitors arrive not to be felt, but to take root. Now that you've seen how emotions can be sent like shadows slipping through the cracks, it's time to move deeper into the physical traces these forces leave behind. The strange objects and arrangements that appear when something unseen decides to anchor itself into your world. Sign 4, the obsessed one. Some people don't envy you. They feed on you. There is a kind of darkness that does not arrive as a storm or a shadow or a curse whispered under breath. It arrives wearing a familiar face, a face you once trusted, maybe even loved, a face you never thought you would have to guard yourself against. And it was through such a face that Adrian first encountered the truth, that some people do not envy your light. They consume it, quietly, carefully, one glance at a time, until the warmth inside you falters in places you cannot explain. The person was Lena, a woman who had once been one of his closest confidants, someone who understood the texture of his silence and the rhythm of his thoughts, someone who knew how he took his coffee and how he carried his grief, someone he had never imagined would become a shadow trailing behind him. But shadows have strange origins, and sometimes they grow not from betrayal, but from obsession dressed as affection. It began with small things, the kind of subtle shifts most people would overlook. A glance held a moment longer than comfort allowed, not hungry, not admiring, but consuming. A smile that curved carefully at the lips yet refused to touch the eyes, as though she were mimicking the expression rather than feeling it. A presence that lingered too long in rooms he had just left, as if she needed to breathe the air he displaced. At first he dismissed it as projection, a trick of exhaustion, but as days became weeks, the sense of being watched, measured, studied grew undeniable. There were gatherings where Lena didn't speak much, choosing instead to sit in a corner with her hands folded neatly in her lap, gaze tracking him with the steady, deliberate stillness of a predator disguised as a friend. She never interrupted, never intruded, yet her silence pressed against him like fingers resting on his spine, creating the uneasy awareness that she wasn't listening to his words, but to something deeper, something beneath his words, as if she were tuning herself to the quiet frequencies of his life. He began to feel her presence even when she wasn't there, the same way one feels the phantom warmth of a hand after it has been removed from the skin. If he thought of going somewhere, she appeared in the same place without explanation. If he planned something in private, she somehow already knew. It was not coincidence, it was tethering. The kind of tethering that happens when someone's fixation becomes so dense it forms a gravitational pull, drawing energy from you without permission. And on the nights when Adrian felt most drained, when the house grew too still and the air pressed close to his skin, he sensed her thoughts, not in words, not in psychic visions, but in pressure, in weight, in a strange tightening in his chest that told him someone somewhere was thinking about him with an intensity that pierced the boundary of his being. It felt like being touched through thought, like an invisible hand sliding along his aura, mapping it, memorizing it. This was not love. This was not longing. This was hunger pure, cold, and shapeless. In the realm of spirit, obsession has form even when the body remains still. And Lena's obsession began to cling to him like vines creeping along the side of an old house, silent and slow, wrapping around his energy field with a patience that bordered on predatory devotion. He could feel it in the way his emotions distorted during conversations with her, as if she were pulling threads of his inner world and weaving them into her own. He could feel it in the subtle drain that followed her presence, a fatigue that settled deep in his bones, even when she had done nothing but smile in that quiet, unsettling way. Energy is not neutral, and hers moved toward him with a purpose that disturbed the deepest part of his instinct. There came a day when he realized the smile she wore had changed, not on her face, but in its intention. It was no longer the expression of someone happy to see him. It was the expression of someone who needed to see him. A smile shaped not by joy, but by fixation. A smile that said, "I watch you because watching is the only way I can feel alive." In those moments, the Stoic within him rose quietly, a gentle but firm command beneath the fear. A mind ruled by clarity does not ignore shadows, it inspects them. And so he watched her more carefully, noticing the way her posture leaned ever so slightly toward him, even when she stood far away. The way her eyes tightened when someone else touched his arm or made him laugh. The way her silence sharpened when he pulled away, as though some inner thread were tightening in protest. And as her jealousy thickened, he felt it take shape literally. It moved through the air like a density, a heaviness that brushed against his skin whenever she thought of him with possessiveness or resentment. He would be at home, alone, washing dishes or reading, when a sudden heat would flare across his shoulders, a meaningful heat, as though a thought had touched him. And in that moment, he knew she was thinking of him again, darkly, intensely, sending emotion toward him like a whisper meant to leave marks. Jealousy, when concentrated enough, becomes a substance. And intention, when sharpened by obsession, becomes a blade. He felt both on his skin, long before he admitted it aloud. Some people do not envy your light. They feed on it. They attach themselves to it. They shape their identity around it. And without meaning to, without understanding the damage they cause, they become the unseen hands that drain you from afar. Now that you've met the obsessed one, the quiet predator who feeds through attention, rather than action, it's time to move into the next sign, where the invisible crosses into the physical, and the spiritual begins leaving objects behind as anchors in your world. Sign 5, life glitches. Reality starts misbehaving. There comes a point in a spiritual attack when the unseen no longer restrains itself to the inner landscape of emotions or the quiet chambers of thought, when the invisible decides that whispers are no longer enough and begins interfering with the physical world, bending reality in small, deliberate twists that seem harmless at first glance, but grow more pronounced, more pointed, more personal with each passing day, until the fabric of your life feels congested, choked by an energy that has learned how to tamper with the flow of your path. For Jonah, a man whose life had always unfolded with the steady reliability of someone who walked with purpose, the first signs were so minor he almost laughed them off. The hallway lights in his apartment began flickering whenever he passed beneath them, not randomly, not with the irregular sputter of old wiring, but with the precise timing of a heartbeat, dimming as he approached, brightening when he paused, as though something unseen were inhaling and exhaling through the electricity. Then came the devices. His laptop shut down in the middle of a career-defining presentation, not freezing or lagging, but snapping off completely, as if someone had pulled the cord from the wall. His phone, freshly charged, would jump from 80% to 0 in seconds during urgent calls. Emails that he had sworn he sent never appeared in anyone's inbox. Texts he typed vanished before his thumb touched send, dissolving into the digital ether as if some unseen hand erased them before they could reach their destination. But the real unraveling began when these small distortions stopped being inconveniences and became consequences. When moments that mattered most twisted into failure with the precision of sabotage. Jonah had been waiting months for a promotion, a step that would reshape his future. He prepared meticulously, rehearsed every detail, filled his mind with clarity. But on the morning of the final meeting, his alarm set on 3 different devices did not ring. All 3 were found later with alarms disabled at exactly the same time, down to the second. He arrived 15 minutes late, breathless, heart pounding, unable to explain how a morning designed with such discipline had betrayed him so cleanly. It happened again when he went to sign a lease for the apartment he had dreamed of for years. The elevator stalled between floors for 9 minutes, long enough for another applicant to sign ahead of him. The building manager apologized profusely, insisting the elevator had never malfunctioned before. Jonah simply nodded, though inside him something quiet tightened, a sensation that did not feel like disappointment, but like interference. Even relationships began slipping. Messages he thought he sent never showed up. Calls dropped just as conversations turned vulnerable. Friends grew irritated, thinking he was ignoring them. His romantic interest accused him of playing games when he never even received her replies. He checked his phone again and again, but the truth remained. His reality was not behaving like everyone else's. It was glitching, precisely, selectively, cruelly. At night, when he lay awake staring at the ceiling, a realization crept into him like cold water seeping under a locked door. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't life being unpredictable. This felt like a hand, an invisible one, pressing against the trajectory of his life, nudging it off course every time it aligned with something good. Something necessary, something that might elevate him. There were moments when he could almost feel that hand on the back of his neck, a subtle pressure that whispered, "Not this way. Not this time." And the more he acknowledged it, the more undeniable it became. Doors that should have opened swung shut in his face with uncanny precision. Opportunities slipped away in the final second, like a coin always falling the wrong direction, no matter how fairly it was tossed. Tiny conflicts erupted with startling ease, turning harmless misunderstandings into arguments that tore connections apart. It was as though the world around him was being bent at its hinges, reality itself tilting, not to break him entirely, but to ensure he remained just a little off balance, just a little behind, just a little out of sync with the life he was meant to live. The Stoic inside him, the part of his soul trained to observe patterns instead of panic, began noticing something deeper. Every glitch happened only when he was on the brink of change, always right before progress, always in the moments where his life began to rise. And that was the clearest sign of all, for nothing attacks what is stagnant. Darkness interferes only when light begins to move. When reality misbehaves around you with such precise timing, it is not life pushing back. It is something else bending the path beneath your feet. If you've ever felt this inexplicable derailment of your life's momentum, know this: the world does not distort itself without cause, and the unseen does not place its hand on your fate unless it fears the force of your potential. Before we move further into the next sign, where presence becomes physical and the energy invading your life begins to watch you with an intelligence that chills the soul, take a moment to ground yourself. If you're finding truth in these signs, if they echo pieces of your own story, consider subscribing to True Stoic Way, a place where we reclaim clarity from the shadows, where we strengthen the mind against unseen interference, and where we walk forward with calm authority, even when reality itself tries to shift beneath us. Now, let us step deeper. Sign 6, the feeling of being watched. The eyes that exist without a face. There are certain nights where the darkness inside a room does not behave like darkness at all. Nights when the shadows seem to gather with an intelligence that does not belong to the objects casting them. Nights when stillness carries intention and silence grows so thick it feels almost predatory. And for Callum, a man who had never feared the quiet, who had always found comfort in the gentle solitude of an empty room, the first time he felt the presence enter was not through sight nor sound, but through the subtle shift of the air, as if someone had stepped into the room without moving a single molecule. Yet every part of the atmosphere recognized the arrival. It happened on an evening that should have been ordinary. He was sitting at the small wooden desk in the corner of his bedroom, writing, lost in the soft glow of a single lamp, when a faint tremor of awareness slid down the back of his neck. Not fear, not panic awareness. The kind of instinctive alertness the body summons when it senses eyes in the dark. He paused, pen hovering above the page, and slowly lifted his gaze toward the far corner of the room. It was just a corner blank wall, nothing unusual. Yet the space felt occupied, dense, almost swollen with presence. He found himself staring at it longer than he intended, unable to explain why it felt like the darkness there was breathing differently from the rest of the room. He blinked once, twice, convincing himself the sensation would pass, but the longer he watched, the stranger the room felt, as if the shadows were not absorbing the light but pushing back against it. Later that night, when he finally turned off the lamp and lay down in bed, the room changed again. The darkness didn't simply fall, it rose, it thickened. It became a weight, settling itself over him with a slow, deliberate gravity. It was the kind of darkness that seemed to press inward from every corner, the kind where shapes formed just beyond clarity, where the air itself carried an unfamiliar tension, as though the room were holding a breath it could not release. He lay still, eyes open, staring into the black, and that was when the feeling sharpened clean, precise, undeniable. Someone was standing in the corner he had been staring at earlier. Not moving, not shifting, just watching. He didn't hear footsteps. He didn't hear breathing. But he felt the exact point in the room where the presence anchored itself, felt its attention like the faint brush of fingertips along the edge of his awareness. And then the air changed again. It grew colder, but not in a way that matched temperature. It was a spiritual coldness, the kind that settles beneath the skin rather than above it. His breath hitched not from fear, but from instinct. The same instinct that once kept ancient humans alive when eyes watched them from the tree line. He inhaled slowly, steadying his mind the way he had practiced for years, because a Stoic does not panic at shadows. He studies them. But even with a calm mind, the sensation intensified. The air felt tight, as if the room itself had become a lung that refused to exhale. And in that suffocating stillness, a thought drifted through him like a whisper not carried by sound, but by presence. You are not alone. He closed his eyes not to hide, but to feel more clearly, and when he did, the presence seemed to lean closer. Not touching, not speaking, just observing, measuring, studying him with a strange, ancient curiosity, as though it were deciding whether to step closer or remain hidden in the veil between worlds. Some energies do not want to be seen, but they want to see you. Callum felt this truth settle into him like a cold realization drawn from his bones rather than his mind. He could sense that whatever inhabited the corner of the room did not seek attention. It sought access, and access begins with observation. It begins with watching until your guard softens, until your awareness drifts, until you stop noticing the slight shifts in the air. He slowly opened his eyes, expecting the darkness to feel less oppressive, but instead it pressed closer, as though the unseen presence recognized his awareness and responded with its own. His pulse steadied not out of bravery but out of clarity, because deep inside, beneath the tension rising in his chest, beneath the heavy breath of the room, he understood something essential. Intuition never lies. It warns long before the mind catches up. So he lay there, eyes open, staring into the living dark, and the presence stared back, cloaked in the quiet intelligence of something that exists without needing a form. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply observed, because sometimes the only protection a man has in the face of the unseen is the stillness of his own mind, the refusal to let fear distort perception. A moment passed long, heavy, trembling, and then the pressure in the air lifted in a single, subtle release, like the room finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. But he knew it wasn't gone, it had simply stepped back. And the eyes that had no face were still there, waiting. Now that the presence has revealed itself in the dark corners of the room, it's time to move into the next sign, the one where the unseen no longer stays hidden, but begins pulling you away from yourself, severing the connection between your spirit and the identity you once believed was unshakable. Sign 7. Disconnection from yourself. The slow separation of spirit and soul. There is a particular kind of spiritual attack that does not strike the mind with intrusive thoughts or the heart with foreign emotions, nor does it twist the physical world into misaligned patterns. Instead, it moves silently beneath the surface of your awareness, slipping between your breaths, settling behind your ribs, loosening the threads that bind your spirit to your sense of self, until one morning you wake and feel not tired, not afraid, not overwhelmed, but absent, as if the you who once lived fully inside your body had stepped slightly to the side, leaving behind a version that walks, speaks, and functions, but does not fully belong to you. Aria felt this shift long before she understood it. It began as a subtle difficulty focusing, her mind drifting even during conversations she cared about, her thoughts scattering like dust blown across a floor no one had swept in years. She would read the same sentence 5 times, stare at her own hands without recognizing them, lose track of minutes that slipped away as though stolen from beneath her consciousness. She wasn't forgetting, she was disconnecting. Her spirit seemed to lag behind her body, moving a heartbeat slower, breathing from a place several inches outside her skin. At first she blamed exhaustion, perhaps stress, but the sensation grew stranger, more disorienting. She found herself reacting to things in ways that didn't feel like her at all. Someone would say something mildly irritating, and instead of responding with her usual calm, her body stiffened with a coldness she didn't recognize. A friend would make a joke, and instead of laughing, she watched her own lips form a hollow smile she didn't feel. Every gesture felt automatic, rehearsed, as though she were acting out emotions she no longer had access to. The turning point came one evening when she stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair. The motion was familiar, the rhythm slow and steady, but the reflection staring back at her felt like a stranger imitating her movements. She blinked. The reflection blinked. She tilted her head. The reflection tilted. But there was a glass-like distance between them, a thin but impenetrable layer of separation, as though she were observing herself from somewhere far behind her own eyes. She whispered her own name, hoping the sound would anchor her, but even her voice felt slightly detached, like an echo from a hallway she wasn't standing in. She touched her chest, pressing her palm over her heart, willing the warmth to return, but the sensation was muted. Her heartbeat felt foreign, rhythmic but distant, a drum being played in another room. Night by night, the disconnection grew. She caught herself staring at her own fingers, as though they belonged to someone else. She walked into rooms unable to recall what she was supposed to feel inside them. She listened to people talk and felt like she was floating several inches above her body, watching the interaction from a vantage point she had not chosen. There were moments when she stood completely still and felt herself slipping deeper into an internal silence so vast it frightened her. Not the peaceful silence monks seek, but the silence of an abandoned home, the kind with broken windows, hollow rooms, dust dancing in the beams of fading light. Her mind began to resemble that home, echoing, vacant, vulnerable. And in vacant homes, anything can enter. She felt it too, an uninvited presence roaming the corridors of her inner world, brushing against her consciousness with the casual curiosity of someone walking through a house they intend to claim. It did not announce itself. It did not frighten her in the traditional sense. Instead, it made her feel replaced. Not fully, not violently, but slowly, like tides erasing footprints, one gentle wave at a time. There were moments she sensed thoughts forming that were not hers, not in tone or intention. She noticed impulses rise without understanding their origin. She watched herself respond to questions with words she didn't choose. She caught her reflection smiling at nothing, a smile she had not willed. The more disconnected she felt, the more the presence grew bold. Some nights she woke with the sensation of someone standing inside her space, not beside the bed, but within her, close enough to feel its breath pass through her ribs. The air around her felt thick, humming with a low vibration that did not belong to the natural world. And in those moments, her spirit felt like it was being gently pushed out of alignment, displaced by something that desired her body not as a vessel, but as a doorway. She tried grounding herself the way she had been taught, breathing deeply, naming sensations, pressing her feet firmly into the floor. But grounding only seemed to work when your soul was fully inside you. Hers was slipping like sand through open fingers. The Stoic inside her, the part she had cultivated for years, tried to remind her that clarity could still be found in observation, that even as she drifted, she remained the one who watched, and the watcher is never fully lost. So she held on to observation with quiet desperation, refusing to surrender the last thread that connected her to herself. But as the days passed, one truth became impossible to ignore. Her mind was becoming a house with too many open doors. And something else, something patient and intentional, was stepping through them. When the self begins to separate from the soul, the body becomes an invitation. And invitations rarely go unanswered. Now that you've seen how the deepest attacks don't strike from outside, but from within, how the unseen can begin to unweave the fabric of your identity, it's time to enter the final stage, the part where the Stoic shield rises, where clarity becomes your only weapon, and where the path out of the shadows begins. There comes a moment in every descent into the unseen where a person realizes that the force attacking them is not merely feeding on their fear, nor their exhaustion, nor their confusion. it is feeding on their unawareness. The blind, unguarded spaces where the mind drifts and the soul weakens. The unlit corners where doubt gathers like damp air rising from the floor of a forgotten cellar. And yet, hidden beneath that vulnerability lies the one thing darkness cannot consume. The quiet fortress that every human carries within. The inner citadel built not from stone and mortar, but from presence, discipline, and the refusal to surrender one's own mind. The citadel does not appear in moments of joy. It rises in moments of collapse. And it rose for each of them. Adrian, Alara, Mara, Jonah, Callum, Arya, only when the shadows pressed closest. When the unseen presence tried to step across the final threshold. It rose not as a burst of light, but as a slow, ancient awakening, like an old fortress remembering its purpose after centuries of silence. This citadel does not glow. It does not shout. It does not fight with violence. It stands. It stands the way mountains stand against storms, weathered, unmoving, older than anything trying to break them. It stands because the soul remembers itself long after the mind forgets. And when a person turns inward, truly inward, toward that inner citadel, the darkness recoils not from fear, but from recognition. It knows it cannot enter a mind that is fully occupied by its rightful owner. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, each of them felt a slow ember ignite in their core. Not a fire, not yet, but the beginning of one. A warmth that came not from outside, but from the deliberate act of reclaiming awareness. Because awareness is not passive. Awareness is a blade, sharp and cold. When directed inward, it slices away illusion, manipulation, and the thin spectral cords that cling to the unguarded spirit. And so the healing began not in ritualistic chants or elaborate ceremonies, but in simple, intentional acts that realigned the soul with its own boundaries. Space was cleansed, not for superstition, but for sovereignty. Salt around doorways, smoke rising in spirals through dim rooms, gentle bells chiming in corners that had grown too quiet. These were not magic tricks. They were declarations, reminders that the space belonged to its inhabitant, that no uninvited presence, spiritual or emotional, had the right to settle there. Energy cords were cut, not with blades, but with breath and intention. They sat in stillness, envisioning every tether that did not belong to them, every hungry thought sent their way, every jealous gaze, every emotional hook, and with each exhale, those tethers snapped. Some dissolved peacefully. Others ripped away with the violent recoil of something that did not want to release its hold. But release they did, slowly, reluctantly, inevitably. Spiritual protection was rekindled, not through fear, but through remembrance. They surrounded themselves with symbols that carried resonant stones, scents, prayers whispered into dark rooms, boundaries drawn in silence. Their spirits responded, pulling closer, stepping back into alignment with the body they had drifted from. The house inside them, once hollow and echoing, began to warm, candle by candle, breath by breath. Most importantly, they reclaimed the mind. They took it back piece by piece, naming every feeling that was not their own, rejecting every thought that felt foreign, refusing every whisper that tried to masquerade as intuition. They became watchers of their own consciousness, standing guard at the gate with the calm vigilance of ancient sentinels. And in that watchfulness, something extraordinary happened. The darkness hesitated. It paused at the threshold, no longer confident, no longer fluid. It recognized the shift, the sudden solidity of a soul returning to its rightful place. It lingered, testing the edges, but found no cracks. The citadel held. And as they breathed into that clarity, The presence began to retreat, not because they forced it out, but because it could no longer enter. For Adrian, the unseen hand that once drained him loosened its grip as he stood tall in the silence of his room, breath steady, spine straight, claiming the space with the authority of someone who had remembered himself. For Alara, the foreign emotional voice lost its power when she stared into her own reflection and saw not the distance, but the return. For Mara, the emotional storms dissolved when she realized none of them were hers, and she sent them back with calm precision. For Jonah, the glitches ceased the moment he confronted the sabotage with awareness instead of confusion. For Callum, the eyes in the corner of the room blinked out like dying embers when he refused to look away. For Arya, the hollow space inside her refilled with presence, slow and sacred, until she once again inhabited her own skin. In each of them, the same truth revealed itself. Darkness does not retreat from force, it retreats from clarity. When the mind becomes clear, the spirit becomes solid. When the spirit becomes solid, the body becomes sovereign. And when a human being becomes sovereign, nothing unseen can claim them. Before you go, if this journey has awakened something in you, if these signs have mirrored pieces of your own experience, or if you're ready to build your inner citadel with calm strength and spiritual awareness, then I invite you to join us. Subscribe to True Stoic Way, not because it is another channel, but because it is a sanctuary for minds reclaiming themselves, a place where shadows lose their power, and where you learn to walk through darkness with the discipline, clarity, and quiet authority of a true Stoic. This is your citadel. Guard it well.